Is Proverbs 22:6 a promise or a warning? Well, let's find out. Proverbs 22:6 says, in most translations, train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. Okay, so read that way, translated that way, it's clearly a promise. If you train your child properly in the way that he should go, then he won't depart from it even when he's old. But is that accurate? I would submit to you that that is not. That said, this is exactly what most parents, most people who read this verse believe that it is saying, which is unfortunate because scripture and life really demonstrate that this is not accurate. Let me give you some examples. So we have Cain and Abel, raised by the same parents. One of them was righteous, gave good sacrifice to God. One of them was a murderer. He ended up murdering his brother. And from what we can tell of Scripture, he goes on to totally leave God and not follow him at all. Of course, Abel, we can't say if he would have done that because he's dead. But the point is that Cain and Abel, same parents, same upbringing, really, two totally different outcomes. Which is not what this verse is saying if it's a promise. Another example would be Jacob and Esau. Jacob was righteous, Esau was not. Same parents again. They're literally twins. And we see two totally different outcomes, right? But really, one of the biggest examples of this is from the kings of Israel. So Israel and Judah, when it was split, had all of these kings who regularly didn't do what their father did. So one king would be a righteous king who would follow God, do his will, and then his son would do the exact opposite. And this wasn't always the case. Sometimes it was a righteous king followed by a righteous king. But often what we see is a righteous king follows an unrighteous king, which follows a righteous king. But the point is that clearly these kids, these princes are being raised by parents and are going against what they're raised in. Additionally, life in general would argue against this. So my parents, similar to what I've just been talking about, raised two kids really in the same way, and they raised us to be God-fearing sons, and both of us ended up walking away, which directly goes against the promise. And that's actually caused them quite a bit of pain and hurt in terms of like asking the question, where did we go wrong? And I would argue they didn't go wrong. I mean, were they perfect? No. But they also weren't teaching us to do things bad, teaching us bad things. They weren't teaching us, to be sinners. They were teaching us to be God-fearing. Since Scripture can't contradict itself and it can't teach anything false, then this just simply can't be a promise. Because if it is a promise, then all of these examples shouldn't have happened. We should be seeing righteous kids coming from righteous parents, unrighteous kids from unrighteous parents, all the way out through history, but that's just not what we see. We see really a mix. And so a promise, it just kind of can't be a promise. Thus, I would argue that it's got to be a warning. But if it is a warning, how? The way that it's translated in the vast majority of cases just doesn't allow for that warning. This means that really we need to go and look at the Hebrew. So the Hebrew of this verse, I'm going to give you a literal translation without adjusting for the idiom first. and then we'll go back and kind of look at it a little more in detail. So a literal translation of the Hebrew would be train up or dedicate a young man in the mouth of his way, and even when he is old, he will not depart from it. So first off, let's get the in the mouth of his way out of there. And that's really just according to his way or in his way. So I want to make two observations. The first is that the text actually says young man and not child, which, looking at how that word is used in Hebrew across the Old Testament, we actually don't really get the idea of child. It's really young man, and that can be all the way from a child, someone who is young. King David, when he killed Goliath, was called a young man, essentially. But we also see that, like, armor bearers, essentially squires, they all could fit under this term, which we translate as young man, or in this case, it's being translated as child. But what I'm trying to point out here is that this isn't necessarily a parenting verse. This is a verse that is telling people in general how to raise up a young man or woman to follow God. And the second observation is that there's an added word. I'm not sure if you caught it, but the added word is should. So in most English translations, you will see train up a child or a young man in the way that he should go. And when he's old, he will not depart from it. That's just simply not in Hebrew. There is no should. There is no idea of should. It's train up a child in the mouth of his way, or according to his way, and he shall not depart from it. Now, some people assume, actually many scholars assume that according to his way is making sure that you're not trying to force your child into something, or you force a young man into something that he doesn't want to do, that he's not gifted in. That probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense, just because back in those days, I mean, even in some regard in today, but especially back then, like a young man would take his father's business. That's just how it worked. You almost always remained within the trade that your father had. And we're also thinking of Solomon here. Solomon wrote the Psalms for the most part. He was king. He was writing to his own children, his own son. The argument would then be that Solomon was telling his son to raise the next king in what he wants to do, as far as like what he's gifted at and everything like that. But that's just not how that works. Like a monarchy, and we see this in Israel, follows father, son, grandson, great-grandson, and just keeps going. So all I'm trying to say here is that this idea really doesn't hold a whole lot of water if we consider who is talking and who he's talking to. Because you could argue, like, okay, yeah, if we're taking that this is a general audience, then sure, this could be a probable way of interpreting this. But we're not talking about a general audience. We are talking about a father who is king talking to his son, who is a prince, who will be king, who's going to raise up more kings. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to argue that. But that leaves us with a problem, right? So if it's not a promise that raising a child in the way he should go, he won't depart from it, and it's not a raise a child in what he wants to do and what he's gifted in, and then when he's old, he will not depart from it, that doesn't work either. It's got to be this much more sober warning. But part of the problem actually involves how Proverbs was written in general. You see, most of Proverbs doesn't have a whole lot of context to follow, right? They're individual proverbs. So this proverb is disconnected from the proverb above it and below it. Most books of the Bible, you can kind of look above and below the passage or the verse and get a pretty good idea of what is being talked about, and it'll help you interpret the verse. We don't have that so much with Proverbs, but it's not totally missing. And what I mean by that is there is a theme all throughout Proverbs of this idea of a young man, young woman is foolish, and they need to be disciplined to get rid of the foolishness, right? So Proverbs 22:15 has this exact idea. It says, "Folly is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline drives it far from him." This is actually a common theme, like I mentioned. There's this verse, but there are others throughout Proverbs that have that same idea of discipline and needing to train up your sons and daughters with discipline. Like a good father doesn't withhold discipline. So if we consider that overarching theme, we can kind of come back to this verse and go, okay, so what does that have anything to do with this verse? And I would argue that yes, it does. This verse, Proverbs 22:6, definitely has this same idea. Train up a young man according to his way, and even when he is old, he will not depart from it. Which really is exactly what we're seeing today, in the sense of parents, instead of training a child properly, training a child through discipline, are giving all kinds of freedom to their children. And I believe that this is what this verse is directly talking about, is that a child's way, a young man, young woman's way, is foolish. It's folly. And if we train them, if we allow them to go on that path, they will not depart from it ever. And that's something that we need to be really careful about, right? It's a big warning. Honestly, if we let our youth pick the path that they want to go in that sense of, like, according to their folly, untrained, we're just giving them freedom to go and do whatever they want, we should expect to get exactly what we have right now, which is very undisciplined young men and women in our lives. It's what's happening in our culture. There's a lack of discipline. Basically, a youth, if allowed to do what comes naturally, basically if we allow the sinful nature that is in every one of us to run its course, to do what it wants to do, then that youth, or those youths, will not readily depart from the path that they are on. Instead, parents and all those who have authority over our youth, need to show discipline and train properly, that the folly of their ways can be corrected. Because ultimately, if we fail to correct that folly, we can't expect them to turn away later in life after all of the bad habits have developed and had time to take root. Bad habits are really hard to get rid of. And when we've grown up in bad habits, they're kind of there for life, unless the youth is really willing to put in a ton of time, a ton of effort to break those habits. And while it's exceedingly important that we do everything we can to not train up a child in the way that he wants to go, train up a youth in the way he wants to go, we do need to remember one thing. No matter how much effort we put in, no matter how good our teaching is, no matter how good of a job we do in disciplining well, ultimately, every child, every young man, every young woman must make up their own minds as to whether or not they are going to follow a good path or not. That said, this verse is all about warning us not to push into the way that they want to go naturally. Instead, we need to teach them to follow God wholeheartedly, to obey Him. But just remember, it really is up to them. We don't really have a say in it. And that's why this is not a promise. That this verse is not a promise, is because it's all up to them, right? We can do everything we can, or we can do nothing. And the child, when they grow older, can really choose whatever path they want. But they have better chances, way better chances, of choosing a good path, the good path, if they have been trained in it. If you like this video, please hit the like button and subscribe. It will really help me out. And feel free to leave any questions that you have in the comments below. Thanks for watching.